Do you think you could learn anything from a four-time CEO? I know you can, and you're about to do exactly that. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I'm honored to have our guest today. His name is Howard Green, and you're going to know why I'm honored in just a minute. He was a broadcast journalist for 33 years, best known as the founding anchor at Canada's Business News Network, where he hosted the flagship interview program Headline with Howard Green. During almost 15 years at BNN, he conducted more than, get this everybody, 14,000 interviews with many of the leading CEOs and biggest names in business and politics, people you've heard of like Sir Richard Branson, Alan Greenspan, and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Prior to that, Green spent 18 years as a correspondent, producer, and director making programs for a variety of networks, including Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and PBS. He is a two-time Emmy nominee and winner of Canada's top television prize for his documentary work. In 2013, he became a best-selling author with the release of his first book, Banking on America: How TD Bank Rose to the Top and Took on the USA. His newest book is the subject of our subject for today. It is entitled, and if you're watching me, you can see it, Railroader: The Unfiltered Genius and Controversy of four-time CEO Hunter Harrison. Howard, welcome.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for your interest. I'm delighted to be with you.
I'm happy to have you here. Although I have to tell, I told you before I hit record, but now I'm telling everybody else like I'm interviewing the interviewer. So we're going to call this a conversation, Howard. So I won't get too freaked out by this. So I'm really glad to have you here. And for those of you that listen regularly, this is a little bit of a departure because most of the time we have the writer of a book that's about leadership or the leader themselves, right? So we're sort of third person today, but it's not the first time we've been third person. Among others, we did an episode with Philip Barlag called The Leadership Genius of Julius Caesar. So both, Howard, dead leaders. Both Hunter Harrison and Julius Caesar, although one a little further back than the other. So
yeah, I didn't know Julius Caesar, but I did know Hunter.
You did know, and actually, so why don't we start there? How did you come to know? We'll talk more about the book in a minute, but just how did it come to be that you knew him and that led to the book?
Well, as you said, I used to host the main interview program on the Business Channel here in Canada. And of course, we were always interviewing the leading CEOs, the issues of the day and so forth. And Hunter was, although he was American, he was a Memphis boy, he ended up in Canada in the late 1990s at Canadian National Railway, CN, which is one of our two big freight railroads. There are 7 big freight railroads in Canada and the US. 2 of them are in Canada, CN and CP, Canadian Pacific. He ended up running both of them ultimately, but he was at Canadian National, huge company, and he was first chief operating officer, and then he was CEO. And when I was hosting the interview program, I would interview him on their quarterly results and so forth. So that went back to about 2004, 2005. And we started to get to know each other only remotely, kind of like you and I are speaking now, Kevin, over a line. You know, we're looking at each other on TV. He was in the studio in Montreal. I was in Toronto. And when he was leaving CN at the end of 2009, I sent him a note and I said, hey, Hunter, why don't you come to Toronto and sit in the studio across from me? We'll do it face-to-face. We'll do your exit interview. And we did. And so we got to know each other better. I also emceed a dinner in Montreal when he was given a big award around that time as well. And so we started to get to know each other a little more personally. And then he was gone from railroading for a couple of years, 2009 to 2011. We stayed in touch. He was kind of going a little bit squirrely because he wanted to continue to work. Ultimately, he'd been pushed out of CN. I didn't know that at the time. But he was dying to get back into the business. And he was coaxed back by an activist shareholder in New York, a guy by the name of Bill Ackman, who you can probably read about or have read about, active in a lot of companies, a hedge fund guy. And they targeted Canadian Pacific, the other Canadian railroad, because CN had been the worst performing in North America. Hunter was part of the leadership that made it the best performing. CP was the worst performing, and Ackman wanted to bring him back and make a ton of money. Yeah, putting Hunter in to shake up CP. So we reconnected around that time. I'd call him, he'd take my calls. And of course, there was an enormous public and bitter battle here in Canada to install him at Canadian Pacific. CN, his old employer, sued him for, breach of non-compete. That was ultimately settled and thrown out when Hunter did go to CP. But we stayed in touch. And of course, I interviewed him on television through the whole CP turnaround, right, which was astonishing to go from worst to best again. And, in a much shorter time frame, in about 4 years. And he was a hell of a turnaround artist. And so I got to know him through that period. And he knew that I had written a book about the bank. I'm sorry, something's appeared on my screen, an update, a Microsoft Auto update. So I'm going to get rid of that. Here. But anyway, you can still see it. Anyway, stuff happens, right?
Exactly.
So, anyway, we deal with it. But so where was I? We were talking about getting. Oh yeah. So he knew that I'd written the book about the bank, and then I left BNN in 2014, and there was some indication that he was interested in a book, and I was certainly interested in his story. And I had always thought, well, there's a book in this story about this guy, because he's a fascinating, colorful character, conflict wherever he went. He was a never back down from a fight kind of guy, an in-your-face kind of guy, a non-status quo kind of guy, a change agent. He shook things up. He broke a lot of eggs. He broke a lot of glass, but he turned these companies around. And I always thought there was, and he just had a colorful way about it. Memphis guy, great Tennessee accent, great way of putting things. He could be extraordinarily funny, charming. He could be very intimidating, angry. Smoke would come out of his ears. He scared a lot of people. He just had all the, the qualities for a major character in a book. But I had just started working on my second book, which was the memoir of Charles Bronfman, the Seagram heir, the whiskey heir. So I couldn't do two at once, but we reconnected, Hunter and I, in 2016. And he was just in the closing days of his time at Canadian Pacific. It had been turned around. His protege, Keith Creel, was pretty much running the company, and his health was in decline, but he still wanted to work. And things happened very quickly, latter part of 16, early 17, and he ended up at his fourth major publicly traded railroad. I mean, how many CEOs can you name who run 4 publicly traded companies?
Major ones.
Right? Major ones. They've all turned them around. The first one was Illinois Central. I didn't mention that earlier. Not far from you in Indiana. Yeah. Essentially running from Chicago to New Orleans. And CN had bought that in 1998. That's how Hunter had come to Canada. But he had worked his way up the railroading hierarchy from a teenager. As a bad kid in Memphis, pouring oil into the wheels of the rail cars in Memphis, starting when he was 19 at the end of 1963. And he just had this supernatural ability to see how networks, big transportation networks, specifically railroads, worked in 3 dimensions in his mind. I mean, that really came to the fore in his late 20s when he was a so-called train master in the yard in Memphis. Imagine you have 4,000 or 5,000 boxcars in a rail yard, and some come in on one train and you got to take 3 red cars out and put them between a couple of green cars on the other side of the yard so that they can go off to Mobile, Alabama instead of Springfield, Missouri. Well, he was your man because he could move those box cars, as he described it, like playing high-level checkers. And that kind of got him noticed. And then he got more supervisory roles. He had an ability to manage people. Some say he was too tough on people. He was too hard on people. But he described himself as a taskmaster. And that's what he was in many respects, but a leader. He coached and he mentored and all of those things. And I know you want to get into leadership things, but there were many sides to Hunter, but he was certainly, as I say in the title, there's the genius and the controversy. He was a highly polarizing personality. You loved him or you hated him. There was no in between with Hunter.
That was actually going to be one of my questions because, as I told you before we started, I have not read every page. I've read some. I had to read fast because we got the chance to do this interview quickly.
Yeah.
But that was actually going to be one of my questions. It's clear that he was polarizing, right?
Yeah.
It's clear that he had great strengths and blind spots, which we'll talk about. But I was curious if it was truly love or hate, or if there were some people that it depended on the day.
Well, I don't think there was any in between with Hunter. He had a lot of, as I think I described it. I mean, he had an ability to preach. He was from Memphis. His dad was a lay preacher. His dad was a policeman in Memphis, but he was a lay preacher as well. And I think Hunter learned the art of preaching, talking for hours to people without notes. He was a true believer in what he did and in the railroads and how they worked and how they should work. And he convinced a lot of people. I call them wayward parishioners. He turned them into believers. And there were many. There were thousands at CN that he put through so-called Hunter camps, which were retreats where he would speak to them for a long weekend at some plush resort in Florida, like the Breakers. And they'd never been, these were mid-level people, managers who had been singled out as having potential, which meant a lot to those people. Obviously, sure. Hey, Hunter Harrison singled me out for, bigger things. But he would talk to them for hours on end. And he was funny, he was charming, he was, he could be angry, but he told stories. And stories were his way of communicating. He always had a story for something that was, in essence, a parable. It was something to teach people. For instance, there's a story that goes around, whether it's entirely true or not, or has been embellished. And a lot of great storytellers embellish, as you know, and he wouldn't deny it. And his wife would say, oh, that's embellished, but it didn't matter because the story is what mattered. One night on the Burlington Northern Railroad where he worked, that was the second, after that bought the railroad he started at in Memphis, he's out patrolling around and he came across this pickup truck in a field, pair of feet sticking out the window. This was the guy who was supposed to be keeping an eye on the railroad, fast asleep in the front seat of the pickup with his feet sticking out. So Hunter gets out of his car, whatever it was, an Impala, and yanks the guy out, by the feet through the door into the field. And apparently that guy turned around and was one of the best railroaders on the Burlington Northern because he got the you-know-what scared out of him by Hunter Harrison. So now whether in fact it happened exactly like that, I'm not entirely sure, but that's how the story goes. And that's what rippled through the organization.
Sure.
And so, oh man, I better pay attention or that guy's going to rip me out of the, the F-150 or whatever it was back then. And so it didn't matter whether it was entirely true or whether it was an urban legend or it was a bit of this, a bit of that. It taught a lesson and it reverberated. And there were those kind of stories all through CN. Like one night, the line from Chicago to New Orleans was totally gummed up. And he knew because he could see on his screens at home. He monitored the networks of these railroads at home on his screens. And, thousands and thousands of rail cars and hundreds of trains. And something's wrong there. And he calls up the dispatcher. What the hell's going on? Well, this, that, and the other thing. Well, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'll be the dispatcher tonight. You just sit there. I'll be on the phone. I'll run the railroad tonight. And so the guy sat there. He pulled an all-nighter. The CEO of this enormous company, the guy sitting there, the regular dispatcher, watching him, got a master class in how to run the railroad. Harrison unblocked the railroad. So you can imagine the internal network, employee network, damn, this guy, you should have seen this guy last, so, for all the static he created and the rough, tough stuff, there were those moments, those great teaching moments, which reverberated throughout the company as a leadership, model.
Yeah, so let me unpack a little bit of that for everybody. So most of you aren't a CEO today. Some of you are going to be someday. Sure. Whether you are or whether you aren't doesn't matter. The point of what Howard's saying here, I think, is critical, is that the stories that are told about us, and in part they will be told because we tell those stories, are the things that do create the culture around us. And so for all of the hot and cold of our friend Hunter, the reality is that those are the stories that help create the turnaround. Those are the kinds of stories that help to make it happen. I actually found a little short, it's not even a story in any way like what you've just described, but in the book I found this thing, and I will share it really quickly because many of you listening know that I wrote a book about being a new supervisor. So here's the quick story. He's talking about people that they called them, I think, leave earlys or something like that.
Early quits.
Work their full 8 hours. And so it says it's about execution and making people get off their ass. It's training and selling the supervisor, convincing them that they're not mistreating people when they ask them to work their 8 hours. He recalls a labor meeting in Toronto where a supervisor in the back raised his hand. He says, "I can't do this," the man said. "I can't make these guys change what they're doing, and they're my friends." And Harrison says, "Well, you can't be a supervisor." "Well, what can I do?" "Go back to work." Right? So the point is, hey, if you're not ready to be a supervisor, then don't be a supervisor. It's sort of a very clear, there was nothing mean about that as you told the story. It was very clear about how we were going to be successful, and how, and not only how an individual is going to be successful, but how the organization is going to be successful.
Well, just to follow up that, I remember what came after that in the book. He said, we take great mechanics and make them, forgive my language, this is Hunter's language, we take great mechanics and we make them piss poor leaders. Don't do that.
And by the way, that happens everywhere. Yeah. It happens everywhere. It's not just at the railroad and not just at that particular one, whichever.
Sure. I've seen it in broadcasting, So there was another great story that kind of became legendary when he was at CN. He went to Vancouver and he checked into his hotel room, which happened to overlook the rail yard, and there were
happened to or on purpose. We could discuss that, right?
So also in his room, there's a pair of binoculars. So grabs the binoculars. He looks out, sees this locomotive number. I make up the number here, 5369, sitting there. And he goes off and does a little something. 15, 20 minutes later, picks up the binoculars, looks out, locomotive still sitting there, 5369. Gets on the phone, calls through to the guy running the yard. This is Hunter Harrison. Yeah, right. And I'm Moby Dick. And no, it is. And then the guy realized it was Hunter. It was an unmistakable voice. He said, "What the hell is 5369 sitting there for?" "What do you mean?" "Why is that locomotive sitting there?" And the guy's like, "Geez, is the guy God? Can he how the hell does he know that locomotive?" So again, these incidents, these hands-on moments really set him apart, and again, sent a very strong message to the organization.
So, we've really been talking, Howard, the whole time in our conversation about one of his great strengths, and that is the strength of being able to tell stories and to use those to make the points that he wanted to make and to help create the culture that he wanted to create. Yeah. What would you say was perhaps one of his blind spots, or maybe not blind, maybe he was aware that was a weakness for him as a leader?
Well, for certainly optics and politics, he didn't give a hoot about either. Here was this guy, this all guns a-blazing sort of Yosemite Sam character. I'm hearkening back to the Bugs Bunny days, the stuff we used to watch.
Well, you're seeing me, so you know I'm old enough.
You're nodding. I know you get the reference. And he barges into Canada, kind of super polite. We say sorry even when we haven't done anything wrong, and here comes Hunter Harrison and Paul Tellier, who brought Hunter to Canada. He was the CEO of Canadian National at the time. He used to run the federal bureaucracy under the Prime Minister. This guy was a major leader himself and a very tough guy, but he knew politics. He knew how the government worked, how the regulators worked, how boards of directors had to operate and so forth. And by the way, Hunter had very little patience for boards of directors. He thought they were a pain in the butt. They didn't add any value to railroading. They understood, their job was to monitor, and they should stay out of everything else, but don't, stick your hands in the pie. And so, he had very little patience for boards, for government, for regulators. He didn't have a hell of a lot of patience for customers either. And that was something that became a problem for him that everywhere he went, because he said no to customers. He said, no, we can't do it that way. We got to run the railroad on time, on schedule, on our terms. And, we're not going to make money if we run it the way you want us to run it. If we're an airline and we only take off when the passengers show up, we're never going to take off because they're all going to be late and we're never going to make any money. So, and with politics and optics, Paul Tellier told me that they once went into the office of the federal transport minister here, who's in charge of the whole transportation network in Canada, kind of like your transportation secretary of the United States. And Hunter went into this person's office. This is a member of the cabinet, the federal cabinet, and told the guy, you don't know what you're talking about. And Tellier was sitting there totally aghast, like, you tell the minister that? And then Tellier said, I got a call from the majority leader of the U.S. Senate. He wants me to call back. Hunter said to him, don't call him back. What do you mean, don't call him back? He's just going to ask for something. And so he ignored politics, and he got a lot done that way, but it also created some problems for him, particularly when Canadian Pacific tried to buy one of your big railroads, Norfolk Southern, which runs right through Washington, D.C., and the military got involved, the Justice Department got involved, and we're like, what the hell, this Canadian Railroad, and this is a national security threat. So, and Hunter was like, we don't need any lobbyists, consultants to help us in Washington. We got a logical case here. It's just, open shut logical case. Well, Washington doesn't work that way. You need lobby.
That, even those of us that live in Toronto.
So that was a blind spot for Hunter, and that was ultimately a hostile attempt to take over Norfolk Southern, and it did not work, and it was a failure for Hunter, and he was very upset about it. And as he said to me, and I quote him as saying this in the book, I'm a bad loser, and I have not mellowed with age.
Gotcha.
And that was the truth.
So everybody, we are talking with Howard Green, the author of Railroader, the Unfiltered Genius and Controversy of four-time CEO Hunter Harrison. We're regaling the stories of Hunter. For those of you that don't know him, I'm going to just say this to you. If you're watching or listening and you are a reader, and I'm guessing you are or you wouldn't be listening, then this is a book you want to read, first of all. And second of all, if you love biographies of leaders, you want to read this because it's not one that most of you have probably heard of. And so I think there's great value in getting the chance to get insights from somewhere that you might not have gotten them before. You might not know much about the railroading business. Actually, Howard, I used to do negotiating with railroads, Union Pacific, back in a previous life. So I found it fascinating just because of the railroad component. So
yeah, and Union Pacific, by the way, if I can just jump in briefly, Kevin, recently, and of course, as all your listeners and viewers will know, it's the biggest, Union Pacific, but it has just said recently this fall, fall of 2018. I know this is being broadcast February of 2019.
Yep.
That Union Pacific was going to adhere to Hunter Harrison's philosophy of precision scheduled railroading, which is the philosophy he articulated and for which he was famous. And so Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, now CSX, the two Canadian railroads, so it's 5 out of the 7 Class 1 railroads have adopted the Hunter Harrison playbook, precision scheduled railroading.
The model, the playbook, right?
Model, yeah. Whether Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern can do it the way Hunter did it is still an open question, because to your point, it's all about culture, changing the culture of these organizations. And that's what he used the so-called Hunter camps for, these, retreats to try to get people to care, to think like leaders, to think like owners. Andy Reardon is the chairman of Canadian Pacific, also an American, and Hunter had worked with him at Burlington Northern and Illinois Central. Andy told me, and I quote him in the book, if you didn't think like an owner, Hunter didn't have a hell of a lot of time for you. And he really felt that way. He said, just care. Don't, when you're supervising people, don't turn them into worker bees, because that's what you'll get.
Right.
Make them care. Give them authority, but accountability goes with that. Reward, but make people aware of the consequences. There are consequences. And so if you're going to reward, you have to express the consequences as well.
So I'm going to shift gears because we do have an interviewer here. So we have been talking about the book. There's a lot more we could talk about as relates to the book, Howard, I know. But I'm as I'm thinking about everyone who's listening, I'm thinking, how else can I get some valuable stuff out of Howard besides just about Hunter? And so I really want to have you take a second and, obviously all of us as leaders need to, if you want to take it on the surface level, we're probably interviewing people to hire and all those sorts of things, but I want to ask a deeper question.
Yeah.
And the question is, talk to us, give us some advice about being a better question asker, or the direct question is, how do we as leaders get better at asking questions?
I think that's a great question, first of all.
Yay!
But, flatter the interviewer. but no, there are a few points that I would make, and I get that. I do get asked this. I think, first of all, you have to be a listener. And oftentimes, it's as much the vibe. It's creating the relationship with the person that you're interviewing. If you create the right vibe, one person who taught me early on in my career talked about creating so-called cocoon with that person, between you and that person you're talking to, so that you're focused entirely on that person, and you're hearing them, you're listening to them actively, and if you have to ask them a tough question, you're asking it respectfully, and if you're listening to them, if you're trying to understand them, you're trying to pick up their vibes in a true, authentic way, I think you can ask people almost anything if you ask them in the right way. With Charles Bronfman, who the subject of my second book, who, he was the heir to billions, but on the other side of the ledger, he had some great tragedies in his life. His wife, his second wife, died suddenly, hit by a car, walking a dog in front of their apartment on Fifth Avenue in January 2006, 7 in the morning. It was dark, raining. And she was hit by a limo. She was hit twice, run over twice. She died a couple hours later. He was up in the apartment. Suddenly this person is taken from his life. Seagram, it essentially evaporated because of bad deals. They sold their share in DuPont. His nephew took over, got him into entertainment. They sold to Vivendi in 2000 for stock. It went, it was a disaster. So there were, these terrible things. And we had never really talked about the death of his wife. And one night I was in Florida, and I'd been with him for a few days interviewing him. And we went to dinner. And I said, Charles, I'm leaving in the morning. You want to do a bit more talking tonight after dinner. I don't know when I'll be back next, and so forth. So we went back, and we were sitting in his study, this beautiful home in Florida, and it's just the two of us alone in this big house. It's kind of dark, and I just shut up. And the vibe was right, and he just started to talk about losing his wife and what happened that morning in such an honest way. I had a tear in my eye, and I'm getting a chill now thinking about it. As I write in the introduction to that book, sometimes it's as much just being the receptor as being the intervener. And so I was a receptor that night, and I was just listening, and he said it all. So part of it is listening. Part of it is the vibe. A lot of it is following up with the right question. Like somebody says something and you say, well, really? Or why? What happened? And then what? It's often the uncomplicated question.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's not even the direct question. So often in media, you see reporters go up to somebody who's been shaken by a tragedy, and they've got a microphone, they stick a camera and a mic in the person's face, and how do you feel? And you think, well, how do you think I feel? I just lost my house, in a wildfire in California, or I've lost everything, and one time I was interviewing this gentleman whose brother went down on a Canadian warship in 1944 in the English Channel. They were clearing for D-Day, and it was terrible. We lost a Canadian ship and a lot of people that night. And his brother was on the ship, and he was the younger brother. And I, rather than saying to him, Bill, how did you feel about losing your brother 50 years ago? I said to him, well, can you tell me, can you remember how you heard the news? And that immediately triggered something in him, and he told the story.
Which is what you wanted anyway.
Which is what you want. And so it was so moving. Here was this old man who started to talk about how as a kid, he's sitting around the kitchen table at home, and the news came on the radio. Athabaskan, that was the name of the ship, had sunk. And his mother was making dinner, and his mother said, my son is gone. And then this old man started to cry. I hadn't asked him how he felt. I just asked him the factual, paint the picture. What happened? How'd you hear? And he told me.
Go ahead. So the lesson to all of you listening. First of all, before I share the lesson, I'm going to say what I'm guessing everyone listening is thinking, Howard, and that is, I thought we were going to get an interviewer. What we got was a great storyteller. So I want to thank you for that. So the model of doing that for us for the last few minutes is great. But the point for all of you listening that what Howard was just saying, sometimes as a leader, we don't have to ask the question. Sometimes we just need to be there. You used the word receptor, but oftentimes as a leader, folks want to share with us, but we have to give them time and space. And sometimes the best thing we can do is to say nothing. And just often leaders are afraid of that because they don't know what to say.
Yeah.
Often we don't have to say anything. All we need to do is acknowledge that that's where people are. And the fact that we can actively listen to people in that moment can be incredible. First of all, it happens to us in life so infrequently. If it happens from your boss, or in Hunter's case, as the boss's boss's boss,
yeah,
it is hugely valuable. So for all of you listening, do that. Do what you just heard from Howard. It'll change the relationships you have with your team. It'll change the results that you get.
And when you do have to, because being the receptor, being the listener is obviously huge and one enormous component of it. But when you do have to jump in and follow up or intervene or challenge, and by challenging. And I think the good CEOs welcomed the challenging questions. I know Hunter did, because it made them think and it made them formulate stronger answers.
Right.
But when you do have to ask the challenging question or the accountability question, like when I would have to ask CEOs, well, really, should you resign because of this? And they'd be sitting across from me live on television. It was important not to make it personal. It's a human being. And so, but you're asking the question. It's your duty to ask the question on behalf of the shareholders listening, or whomever, the audience. And frankly, they were getting worse, questions from investor relations, screaming.
Yeah, right.
But you can ask anything if you ask it in the right way. I'm a strong believer in that philosophy. And sometimes, with Hunter and I did, I think, 170 hours of interviewing with him, and then another 170 or so with other people he'd worked with, or critics, or union leaders, or whomever. And, I would come back to him, like he'd tell me a story or his account of something. And as you read through the book, you'll see where people differ on certain situations, because there were a lot of contested, controversial situations. But I would go back to him, and he, back to his blind spots. He was a very sensitive guy. Although he was rough and tough and pugilistic, he bruised easily. And so when I would come back to him, I said, well, Hunter, so-and-so said, had a very different recollection than you. He's a lying ass, and so we'd have and that's the way it's going to be. And he'd jump in and he had this thing whereby he went to, you talked about the early quits earlier. He went to, I think it was Homewood, Illinois, and there was a supervisor there who said, and he said, stop it right now, when he went to CN. Well, I don't know, they'll shut down the whole railroad. And he says, a lot worse up in Canada. And he says, where? Vancouver. Well, we're going there right now. We're gonna confront the meanest sumbitch on the railroad. You go to the toughest dude, and you read him the riot act, and then everybody. And so when I came back to him with a bunch of stuff that other people had said, and he got quite irritated with me, I said, just a sec. Remember that story you told me, about the early quits? Yeah. I said, well, I'm going to Vancouver right now. Meaning I'm confronting you right now. Yeah. And so he got it. And I'm confronting the meanest SOB right now, And so he says, okay, what'd they say? What's next? Tell me. All night long, he's needling me. We go to dinner. What's next? What'd they say? And so, and we hashed it out. And he said, okay, I get it. I get the process. I get what you're trying to do here. And so, I think if people recognize, this comes back to your question, if people recognize you're listening and you're being fair to them, I think they're going to tell you a lot.
Yeah. If they understand that your intent is mutually beneficial, right?
Yeah.
And we could have a conversation. We're not, but we could have a conversation at least about your colleagues that do what you do in the U.S. We would say that they aren't doing that very well in many cases, but we won't have that conversation. We're going to go ahead and pass that. How about that? We're talking with Howard Green. He's the author of other books, including other books, but we're talking specifically today about Railroader, the Unfiltered Genius and Controversy of four-time CEO Hunter Harrison. If you love business biographies, you want to read this book. If you've been entranced by this conversation, you want to read this book. If you like the railroad, you need to read this book. So before we go, Howard, just a couple more, maybe three more questions for you. The first one is, what's all this work, Emmy nominations, 14,000 interviews, 3 best-selling books, like what do you do for fun?
Well, I like to do a lot. I love to play tennis. I love movies. I love hanging out with my wife, my dog, and family, and music. I'm a terrible trombone player. I'm an even worse guitar player. Electric guitar was my midlife crisis. And it really is a crisis when you listen to it.
Well, but here's the thing: you don't have to be good at it to like it, right?
No, it's great.
And the reason it's electric is you can plug it in, and your wife doesn't have to hear it.
No, she hears it. She's very patient. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, all those things. I love it. There's not enough time in the day for all the things you want to do, travel or play music or play tennis, whatever.
All right. So Howard, tell me about, I know that you are a writer. I also know you're a reader. So what's something that you've read recently that people might find interesting?
Well, what I read just recently that was very good? Michael Lewis, who of course wrote Moneyball, Blindside, Liar's Poker, all that. An incredible storyteller, writer, researcher. He just has a way of boiling things. Big Short was another one of his. I once had the misfortune of moderating a panel in Las Vegas after he spoke. It's not good to follow Michael Lewis. But anyway, he's just written a book called The Fifth Risk. It's his new book. And it's a fascinating book because it's, we're in a period where everybody, or not everybody, but there are a lot of people very down on government and the services governments provide and funding governments and so forth. Not just in the United States, but it happens here in Canada as well. Mm-hmm. And so now, obviously, the private sector handles certain things much better, and government handles other things better. And so, like the military, or in Canada, we have, certain social programs like national health care system, which I know is very controversial in the United States, but it's kind of worked for us for a long time. Not perfect by any means, but in any event, I went to the doctor today and had something checked, and, it's just, you go in and out, you don't pay anything, it's part of your taxes. But so Lewis has written this book called The Fifth Risk, and it's about the things that go on in government that support all of our other activities that we never think about.
We never think
about the National Weather Service, for instance. Yeah. NOAA, which NOAA, the National Oceanic, the people who watch the hurricanes and so forth, incredible data collection that farmers use, to improve their yields. The agricultural industry depends on all of that kind of thing. And that's all under the Commerce Department, which is headed by Wilbur Ross in President Trump's cabinet. I've interviewed Mr. Ross a few times. I interviewed him for my TD book, actually, and I used to have him on the show. And the Commerce Department, Lewis says, is essentially a data department. It's data. And it's an incredible store of data. And this distaste for government these days is people think when they watch the Weather Channel that the Weather Channel's drummed up all that data. Well, it's all coming from the Commerce Department. Yeah. From the National Weather or NOAA. So there are valuable services within there. I know so there are certain people who don't like to hear this, who are for whatever reason dissatisfied, and certainly I've been dissatisfied with certain government services. But Lewis has written a book about this
to help us think about that in new ways.
Okay, just take a minute and think about what that part of society provides for the rest of us. Like, for instance, he writes about the people who look after nuclear sites, and how we've had some pretty close calls that nobody knows about, and thankfully there are people looking after those things. Yeah. So it's an illuminating book, I thought, and he's a very good writer. Even if you disagree with some of what he says, or you're and it's not like I'm pro government, anti, whatever. I covered business forever, but it's just and see the enormous value business has created, and people like Hunter, the accomplishments that they've made. But it's just another way of thinking about a component of society that provides certain things that we often don't think about. So Lewis has written a good book about it.
Well, listen, I would say to all of you listening, if you've listened before, that I ask every one of my guests that question about what are you reading or what have you read recently. And I think that you made an excellent point, and Howard, and that is that you don't have to agree. I would challenge anyone who's listening to pick a book that you heard from someone else smart who is on this show or anywhere else and say, I may not like that. I don't know, but that's not the point. The point is it help me learn, help me think about the world, even if I'm further convinced of my own perspective. It's like the challenging question, Hunter. It forces us to be clearer about our own thoughts. So
right, and there's going to be people who don't agree with Hunter's methods, and there are many, that he worked with, executives who thought he was too tough, and so they might not agree with certain things, but I think they'll find the book interesting, and they'll learn from it, even if they don't agree with certain things that he did.
We can learn. I always tell folks that you can learn leadership from any leader, whether there's something that you learn from them that you want to do or something you learn from them that you don't want to do. So,
right.
So Howard, before we go, where can people learn more about the book, get a hold of the book, etc.?
Well, thank you for asking that. You can obviously, there it is right there. You can order it on Amazon. You can order it via Barnes & Noble online or in their shops. There are certain independent booksellers who are selling it. There are railroad bookstores out there that cater to the railroad audience that sell it. Here in Canada, there's a chain called Indigo, which is like, your Barnes & Noble, and they're actually starting to set up in the United States. You can go to my website, which is howardgreen.com. Green like the color, howardgreen.com, and there's a cover of the book and a buy button there, so you could that'll take you, right to the purchase point.
All right, every place you can buy books, folks, as well as howardgreen.com. So now I have a question for all of you who are listening, and that is, now what? What are you going to do with this? Besides go buy a copy of the book, there were all sorts of nuggets. We talked about interviewing and asking, listening. We talked about storytelling. We talked about a bunch of stuff in the last few minutes. And so the challenge to you is, what are you going to take and what are you going to use? Because I'm channeling my inner Hunter. He just said, go do something. Don't just sit there and listen. Go do something. That close?
Yeah. So you know what I want to do next with this? I want it to be a movie, a motion picture.
There you go.
There's a biopic in this.
Oh, I think you're right. I've read enough of it to know that. So listen, Howard, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that we had you on, and I appreciate the time this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Kevin. Pleasure being with you. Thank you for your interest.
It was my pleasure. And everybody, we're here every week, so come on back for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. See you all soon.